Good evening and welcome to the show. This is the First Amendment, historically speaking, and my name is Frederick Douglass Dixon and I will be your host. This is our inaugural show for the year 2015. And to wrap up 2014, I have to thank UPTV for the opportunity and all the staff that have been above and beyond professional to allow us to forward esoteric information in a scholarly manner that we think is important to add to the pot of knowledge. And we'd like to thank UPTV and more specifically all of the staff, including Daniel, who's a great young man, and I appreciate his kindness as well as his professionalism. And today, when we talk about 2015, it being January, I think it would make really good sense and an excellent topic to talk about today is the life and times of Dr. Martin Luther King. As we know, lots of folks will be celebrating his birthday on the 19th, but there is a movie that's coming out today that is called Selma. That is a look at Dr. King and perhaps one of the most influential marches in history as far as what happened prior, what happened after, and the legend and the legendary status that was built by Dr. King during this particular time. So with Selma, Alabama, a very unique place. Alabama in itself, a very unique place, but Selma, I'm really looking forward to partaking from the film and looking to its historical accuracy. So when we look to this genre of entertainment to provide us historical accuracies, we have to be very careful. We have to be sure that when we talk about Selma and how it took place, this march took place, and the role that it played in the civil rights movement and history and American history, then we have to be very critical about what it is that we will see with this movie and where it will land as far as historical misnomers and things that we perhaps don't know took place that will perhaps come from this particular film. So when we look to a historical specific epic, and then we look to entertainment, the entertainment industry, to forward us information, we have to be very careful because number one, the entertainment industry, the bottom line is always profit. So if sex and violence sells, then that's why we're overwhelmed with sex and violence by that particular industry. So we want to be very critical about the movie in itself. And I say to you all as a wise group, do not allow the entertainment industry to trump your ability to research these particular historical epics on your own. So it is good to see the movie. Yes, it's good to take your children to see the movie, to connect them, but it's far more needed and far more mandated to follow up on what the movie perhaps did correctly and what it would forward. So let's take the movie for what it's worth, an entertainment piece. And then from there, look to the historical pieces that came behind it. So I think it's very relevant now. And just think about the timing of this particular movie. It comes right on the cusp of Dr. King's birthday. Those things are not by coincidence or happenstance. All of those things are by design. So when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we talk about perhaps one of the most famous Americans of all times. And lots of folks have said, and these are historians, lots of historians have said his oratory skills were perhaps the best in the 20th century. And they also tie him into the idea of Adolf Hitler and being a great spokesperson and one who could capture a crowd by vocabulary, pitch, tone, and the ability to be right in the middle of being able to absorb a social atmosphere. So Dr. King in himself is looked to as the great orator. And we have to be very serious when we look at Dr. King. Dr. King and a lot of our historical figures have been lessened to a coined term or a phrase. Dr. King has now been lessened to one particular phrase that we all know that he said without question. And we talk about the idea of the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. So to bring relevance to this particular birthday that Dr. King has and the movie coming out at that time, then perhaps what we can do here is add some really serious information about Dr. King to shed a light on him that would put him in a position that would be better understood by the youngest person who's watching. That is indeed the aim. The aim is to expose the youngest who's watching. So when we talk about Dr. King, we have to understand that Dr. King was the son of a very serious man. And his father was a Southern preacher, but his father was of the mind of the importance of education. Now, with Dr. King's father, affectionately known as Daddy King himself was a son of a preacher. So when you look at the lineage of Dr. King, for us to be able to pay attention to Dr. King and his brilliance, please pay attention to those who nurtured and raised him. We'll say this again. We say this quite often, but we want to be very clear when we say this. When you're looking to clarity and depth on any issue, pay more attention to the teacher than you do the student. So with Dr. King, his father was indeed a very stronghold for Dr. King his entire life, and one who forwarded Dr. King how to react in certain situations and what he thought was important, you saw come through Dr. King. So with Dr. King, his mother, Alberta Williams King, was a school teacher. So in the household, there's a preacher and a teacher. So when you hear Dr. King, understand from the essence, there was a preacher and a teacher who taught him how to speak and how to understand the importance of education. Now, here we go with esoteric information. Lots of folks. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., January 15th, 1929 to April 4th, 1968. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not his original name. His original name was Michael Lewis King. So the importance and the connection that Daddy King had to his son's brilliance and what he would do to the world. During 1931, Daddy King traveled to Germany. And during that time, he realizes the importance of what a name would mean to him as well as his son. So in 1931, as he travels abroad, Daddy King connects, because his reading was extensive, he connects to traveling and meeting folks and looking to historical perspectives to guide his family as a father. So when he travels to Germany, he actually changes his name to Martin Luther, as well as his son's name to Martin Luther King Jr., that represented the great reformer, Martin Luther, who charged the Catholic Church with dishonesty, deceit, and corruption, and tacked 95 theses on the wall for the idea of forwarding to the Catholic Church how he felt about it, which is now drawn into and blossomed into what now we know as the Lutheran Church. So with the great reformer, Daddy King's brilliance is shining through directly as he understands the connection of what his son would be as the great reformer. Some of those things are connected to a higher being, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called God a lot of time his cosmic companion. So when we understand that Daddy King was so very influential, his mother was so very influential on him, that we can begin to see Dr. King as a human being and not this iconic view of a person. Yes, he was very iconic, but he was indeed more human and one who had the fortitude of a soldier and not given his, well, maybe misunderstood as far as being a warrior and a revolutionary. Dr. King was indeed both. So when we talk about Dr. King, we talked about from the very beginning, we want to talk about Dr. King going to school at the age of 5. So he was at that time the age 6. This is prior to what we know now as formal education. Dr. King was always academically ahead of the masses of the students that he went to school with. So his mother, her role as a teacher and teaching the fundamentals, and we should never forget this in the idea of what women mean, being the first nurse and the first teacher. But it comes through in Dr. King's brilliance. It comes through as he continues to go to Booker T. Washington High School. And as Dr. King goes to Booker T. Washington High School, he leaves Booker T. Washington High School at 15. You will find absolutely no graduation certificate, no diploma for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Martin Luther King Jr. from Booker T. Washington High School. See, this becomes very esoteric information, and that's why we're forwarding this to you. The idea of Dr. King leaving high school as a sophomore and entering Morehouse College. Well, how does that happen? How does something like that take place? We think about our students now. We think about our children now. It'd be very difficult to send a sophomore to college, being prepared, not just academically, but socially for what he would be attuned to and what would make him successful. So Dr. King was indeed unique. So the story reads that Dr. King's father, Daddy King, had a really close friend in the admissions department at Morehouse College. And it went simply as this. He said, if he can do the work, send him. So there is no high school diploma for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was that brilliant at 15, where he becomes a freshman at Morehouse College, Atlanta, Georgia. So now we're beginning to see the home training as it explodes, and Dr. King becomes this brilliant scholar, but it starts in the home. So for all of you all, and most of you ladies who happen to be able to hear what we're saying, it's very important that you are attuned and you can forward information when your child comes home from school. So this indeed is a charge, the first nurse and the first teacher. So it's brilliantly put together in Dr. King's life as a shadow, as a cast, as a skeleton of what to do with your children. So when we talk about Dr. King, we understand that he's now finished with Morehouse College in 4 years by 1948. He moves on to Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania. And this is where the life begins to change, because Dr. King is now in his first integrated school. He becomes attuned to some of the racial tensions that go on outside of Atlanta, Georgia, outside of the South, which begin to mold him. And Dr. King becomes very aware of his position as a black man in America and some of the things that he can and can't do. The constraints become so large that he begins to write. And he talks about some of these things and the constraints upon a black man at a very early age. But Crozier Seminary Institute becomes a turning point in Dr. King's life, because a lot of people don't understand that Dr. King was very close to being engaged to someone other than Coretta Scott. Dr. King was very close to being engaged to a German cafeteria worker whose name was Betty. Now, if you think about taboo of black, white, or interracial relationships being removed now because our society is so post-racial, then imagine 1950 and imagine the role that a mixed relationship or a interracial relationship would play socially and how it would play out even as far as Pennsylvania and the taboo that it would cause. So Dr. King was very serious about Betty, to the point where he wanted to bring her home to Atlanta. And there was a lot of pushback on both sides. She understood that it wasn't wise. He understood that it wasn't wise. But being a young man in love, I'm sure that he fought tooth and nail, and they talk about it all the time. But there he is again, the brilliance of Daddy King, so that was shut down. No longer was he to be engaged. No longer was he to be in this relationship with Betty. So some things we don't really know about Dr. King, that Dr. King had an eye for women outside of the black community. So now when we look to Dr. King, we are very serious about exploring some of these things that have been lessened or eliminated in the history of Dr. King, which gives you a clearer picture and shows you just how poignant he felt about particular issues and what got him to be that point. So after he leaves Crozer Seminary Institute, he goes to Boston University, receives a PhD, and he's done by 1955. PhD. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Atlanta, who started out Michael Lewis King in 5th grade. But sometime around 2 years old, he becomes Martin Luther King Jr. The brilliance of Daddy King shows again. And if we go to what make Dr. King famous, then we go to December 1st, 1955. And this is the day that Rosa Parks is arrested for not wanting to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. But if you know anything about Rosa Parks, this was not outside of the norm with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was indeed a radical as well. So now the usual suspects that we claim for Black History Month, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, we don't hear much about them being radicals, but they indeed were. And they go down in history as those who were compliant, but we ask you to do just a little bit more research, and I'll give you this coin term: research your researcher. That's where we are. We want you to be attuned. So, and when we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, and then we have to go to what led to the Montgomery bus boycott, it being chose in such a way. There was a boycott in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in the late 1940s, which was used as a blueprint. Very successful in some ways. So now the Montgomery bus boycott becomes where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, under a lot of stress and strain, because there was a group that was a lot older than Dr. King, that was a lot more settled in that community, and who were the old thought and the old heads, if you will, about that particular thought. So Dr. King becomes a president of this particular organization, but not under the simple auspices of his greatness being looked to lead this particular cause. He was chosen, but there was a lot of contempt about him being chosen. E.D. Mixon is a name that you want to tie into that. And January 30th, 1956, as this particular bus boycott is winding down, Dr. King's house is bombed. So Dr. King becomes now a victim of what he thought nonviolence would produce. He was never under the illusion. And he talked about agape love. But Dr. King always said he had no reason to hate what white folks did. He said hate was too strong of a term to waste on people that treat you so badly. So more esoteric information about Dr. King is approximately 10 years before Dr. King's demise, he was nearly assassinated in New York City. He was on a book signing tour, and the name of the book was Stride Toward Freedom, and the date was September 20th, 1958. King was approached by a young lady, Izola Ware Curry, who was a domestic who lived in New York, who worked as a person who took care of a white family who heard so many negative things about Dr. King, who heard so many controversial things about Dr. King, and with not much information. And they also said there might have been a mental illness as well. She stabs Dr. King with a letter opener in his aorta. Dr. King in his aorta. And this is where, if you've ever heard of Dr. King's speech, if I had just sneezed, he would have died. He said it in so many ways, and he said it so many times during that particular speech. If I had only sneezed 1/2 of an inch, if I had only sneezed. So Dr. King, at this particular point in his life, is becoming very popular. Some of the things that he's accepted as far as Mahatma Gandhi's thought on how to go about civil disobedience are being challenged. Dr. King is becoming what we look to now as the face of the civil rights movement. A lot of pressure on Dr. King, a lot of pressure on his particular group. Now imagine that kind of pressure for a young man, very young man, very wise young man, and his brilliance allows us to look deeply into it. But Dr. King was indeed under a lot of pressure. So when we move along, we talk about the March on Washington. And when we talk about the March on Washington, we talk about 1963, but we have to set up that particular summer. So the March on Washington, September 1963. So we need to set that summer up. That summer starts in Mississippi with the death of Medgar Evers, killed, shot, assassinated by Byron De La Beckwith, Jackson, Mississippi, in a subdivision. So after Medgar dies, and Dr. King was indeed at the funeral, after Medgar dies, there is in Birmingham the death of 4 little girls, Collins, Wesley, Robeson, and McNair. So the tension of 1963, and after the March on Washington, there's also a very historical event, November 22nd, 1963, is the death of President John F. Kennedy. So if you look to the atmosphere of 1963, very turbulent. And Dr. King is right in the middle of forwarding perhaps what is known as his most famous speech. So when he talks about the March on Washington, and we talk about Dr. King, most folks say, I have a dream, my 4 little children. Well, there was a point during this particular speech, and I'll let Dr. King's words speak for themselves. He says, but we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of the opportunity of our nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Well, a lot of folks don't like to talk about Dr. King being a radical. A lot of folks like the safe Dr. King, the I have a dream Dr. King, the one slogan Dr. King, the Dr. King that they would like to tell you, and it's been said on several occasions, that he, for the most part, plagiarized some of his dissertation. Dr. King in himself understood far more brilliantly than folks knew. And Dr. King became further and further away from where he started with the idea of nonviolence to being far more radical towards the end of his life. And Dr. King said in a meeting in 1966 with the most honorable Elijah Muhammad on the corner of 49th and Woodlawn, he said that he was very afraid that he was integrating his people into a house that was burning. So when we talk about Dr. King being a radical, we have to be very, very clear that Dr. King, indeed, his whole idea was radical. His whole idea was to use civil disobedience with nonviolent measures to affect the change. Now, we talk about Dr. King and the Nobel Peace Prize. Oslo, Norway, December 10th, 1964. And Dr. King is the very first black man to speak in St. Paul's Cathedral. With Dr. King, he was breaking barriers. He was the Time Man of the Year. Dr. King was indeed one who we can look to. And as we move along with Dr. King in his life, the things that become quite obvious is when he begins to stand up and oppose the war in Vietnam. He goes from everybody's great ambassador of nonviolence to everybody turning their back on Dr. King. We're talking about the Jewish community that funded Dr. King, the black community that supported Dr. King, and those who were indifferent about Dr. King began to look to Dr. King as some sort of nemesis when he says, why, and you should read this, why I oppose the war in Vietnam. This is some of the most radical statements that Dr. King would make. And esoterically speaking and giving information, there was a Reverend Bevel, who was very serious about he was in Dr. King's inner circle, but he was very serious about Dr. King taking a stance on the war in Vietnam, while the others in Dr. King's camp thought it was going to be suicide. Well, when he took a stance on the war in Vietnam, it was the beginning of the end of Dr. King's popularity as well as his life. And I'll read you a quote when he says it just like this. There's something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that will praise you when you say, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say, be nonviolent towards those little Vietnamese children. There's something wrong with that press. And he goes on to say in 1967, 1 year to the day before his actual assassination, when he says a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Dr. King was indeed becoming far more radical with the idea of how to deal with America, how to deal with Lyndon B. Johnson. He began to fall out of favor where Whitney Young became more of one who was accepted. So now the black community has turned their back on Dr. King. And some of the things that they said about Dr. King during the last year of his life were incredible. But pay attention to them because they're obviously of the learned kind, which makes you far more attuned. So when we talk about Dr. King, there's a part of it that it reads from a speech. He says, where do we go from here? I must confess, my friends, the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will be still rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there. There will be those moments when the bureaucracy of hope will be transformed into fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ephemeral hopes blasted. We may again, with fear-trenched eyes, have to stand before the barrier of some courageous civil rights workers whose life will be snuffed out by the dastardly acts of the bloodthirsty mobs. Difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in these days ahead in an audacious, faithful in the faith. I'd say to you, Dr. King was indeed a very radical thought whose understanding evolved as he moved along. And if you want to pay attention to the demise of Dr. King, pay attention to the lectures that you can find on YouTube by Dick Gregory and Mr. Stokely Carmichael talks about his death. And when we talk about Steve Coakley, these particular people that you can look to on YouTube and find answers, I say to you, Dr. King is indeed a person that's worthy of our fervent research without it being sugarcoated. I can appreciate some of the things that Dr. King stood for. I can understand his brilliance, and I look to Dr. King in a clear manner and understand his brilliance. I say to you, Dr. King and his birthday is well worthy of your research. So not only do you look at Dr. King in a different light, let's look at him in his entirety as a black man in America and what he completed. Ladies and gentlemen, this information may in no means change your mind, but because truth and you are so very valuable to me and precious, I just thought you ought to know. I remain with esteem and respect a distinguished man of color, Frederick Douglass Dixon. Run tell that.